Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to learn about the basics and the fundamentals of foreign exchange. We're going to draw the two related graphs for foreign exchange markets, and then we'll summarize what the shifters of foreign exchange are. So let's get started. So in the first part of this lecture, it's just some basic kind of fundamentals about the foreign exchange market. And even though some of these might seem really elementary, I do think it's helpful for us to kind of briefly touch on what they mean. So the first part just tells you that the foreign exchange market and understanding what foreign exchange is when we're trading one currency for another currency. And so fundamentally, this is really just a supply and demand graph. I think it's helpful to remind yourself, if you ever feel a little bit lost with them, that they are just supply and demand graphs. And so in class, what I do is I kind of remind you, like you have a quantity of, let's say, Big Macs. If the good or the service is Big Macs, the quintessential most famous meal from McDonald's. And when we have Big Macs, you have supply and you have demand like that. And instead of price, I would tell you that just kind of remember that price is equal to something. It's the same thing as saying how many US dollars for one Big Mac, right? And so when we say price, that's really what that's equal to. And so if we said that the number of Big Macs or the amount of dollars is $4.75 per one Big Mac, that's really what we're saying is US dollars per the division bar per one Big Mac. And so in foreign exchange, we actually are going to write out US dollars per one of whatever this particular thing is. That way it helps us make clear which one's the currency that's being traded, in which case that would be the Big Macs, and what's the price of it. It's expressed in dollars. If it were, say, the other way around, it might be how many yen in the numerator of that divided by how many dollars. And then that would be the yen price of a dollar. It would be the market for dollars. So again, we're only going to be dealing with kind of currency pairs, one currency and another. That's really how currency is traded on the markets, is like how many Hong Kong dollars for Chinese yuan, or how many Jamaican dollars for Canadian dollars, or whatever, right? They're only going to be one to one. And so as a consequence of that, there's actually two related markets. There's going to be the market for, say, dollars priced in yen, and then there would be a related market for yen priced in dollars. And they're really just two sides of the same coin, right? If you have the market for dollars priced in yen, it's the same, but the opposite for the yen market priced in dollars. And we'll see that in just a second here when we go to draw both. A couple of assumptions that we're going to make that are not true in the real world, but we make them to be able to simplify some of our analysis. The first is that the only reason that somebody might demand a currency, that they might want a currency, is to buy something with it, right? It only exists to buy goods, services, or assets. So we can say XN or assets. That's the only reason that you want a currency, is to buy goods and services or financial assets. And that the related correlate of that would be that the only way that you can pay for those goods and financial assets is only in the local currency. And that really just precludes us from getting into kind of more complicated topics like currency speculation and maybe the undervaluation or overvaluation of a currency. All of that stuff is kind of not part of the purview or scope of an introductory macro class. Now, that being said, if I know that I only need a foreign currency for buying something with it, and I know that I can only buy something with that foreign currency, then that actually means that the price of the currency has an effect on the relative price of the goods. And that's a really, really important sentence. So I'm going to say it again to you. The relative price of the price of the currency, right? Like if the currency is expensive or if the currency is cheap, that's going to have an effect on whether the goods or the assets are expensive or cheap. And as I typed here, if the local currency becomes more expensive, then the local goods, services, and assets become more expensive relatively, right? Relatively to foreigners, is how we would say that, right? So I probably should be a little bit more specific here, that the goods themselves or the assets themselves are actually staying the same price. It's that now they are relatively cheaper or relatively more expensive for the foreigners to buy. So we would say that if a currency, say, appreciates and goes up in price, if it appreciates and goes up in price, then their net exports will go down. That's because the currency being more expensive makes the goods and services relatively more expensive. However, if the currency depreciates or goes down in price, right? So up in price, appreciate, down in price, depreciate. We would say that their goods and services are becoming relatively cheaper because the currency is relatively cheaper. And as a result, their net exports would increase. This is a really important part, right? Key to note that if the currency is going up in value, your net exports are going to fall. If your currency is going down in value, your net exports are going to rise. That this is a fundamentally important outcome because it allows us to link this foreign exchange market to GDP. Right? If XN is part of aggregate demand and GDP, then now we can bridge this type of market that we're dealing with, the foreign exchange market, and say, how does it affect the real economy, the amount of GDP that we produce? So let's draw the graphs for foreign exchange, and then we'll kind of talk through what some shifters of foreign exchange might look like. And we'll just say, for the purposes of our class, we'll just use maybe euros and dollars, right? US dollars. So the first step that I'm going to say for when you graph these is to put the label down on the bottom, quantity euro and quantity of US dollars. That's the quantity of whatever we're dealing with here. Remember, when we had Big Macs, it's the quantity of Big Macs and the Big Mac market. And then we're going to have a plain old supply and demand graph, but we do need to make sure we're labeling the axes. Now, the axes are the bottom matches the bottom of that fraction. And so the top is in the other currency, right? So I kind of put a line here just so we understand that these are two separate markets. And so this one, the top is going to be US dollars. The bottom must match the bottom, euro. And so we would say that these values, right, whatever this number is a reciprocal of the other. So if we said that they were 1-to-1 to begin with, and maybe there was a greater demand, we'll say, and kind of a shifter here, a greater demand for, say, European goods by Americans. So the Americans say, gee, I really love European stuff. Well, that might increase the demand for euros because in order to buy the European stuff, they need the euros to do it. And that would cause the euro to appreciate, to go up in price. And we'll just say that now the new euro price in dollars is 2. The way we would read that is to say now it takes 2 US dollars to buy 1 euro, and it only used to take 1. So the price of the euro went up, the euro appreciated. But in order to buy those euros, and here's where this is really important, there's always a supply change of the other, right? In order to buy the euros, the Americans had to supply more dollars into the foreign exchange market. And sometimes I make this analogy in class that it can be helpful to envision you're walking up to that airport kiosk where you exchange your money for Forex, and you say, I want to buy euros. The guy at the kiosk is going to say, you have to pay, right? And what do you have to pay with? You'd have to pay in dollars because you're an American. So they would supply more dollars to the foreign exchange market. Now, this new number, right? This new number is actually going to be the reciprocal of this number. That's because, notice the axes, right? Euro over dollars is the same thing as a reciprocal of dollars over euros. So this is going to be 0.5, and we would say the dollar depreciated, right? Dollar down, depreciate, right? So we would say the US dollar depreciated, and we would say the euro appreciated. It went up in price. So just kind of reminding ourselves what that language, the lingo is. There are 3 other shifters of foreign exchange, and I would just kind of talk through one of them, the tastes one. The second one is income, and income here means GDP, right? GDPR. It also means kind of like household income is another way to view that, right? Household income. So there's a variety of ways that we could have more income, more GDP. But if our income, the Americans' income, is higher, then the Americans are going to buy more of everything. And as a result of buying more of everything, they're going to buy more European stuff, right? They buy more of everything, but including imports. And so when the Americans' income goes up, we would say that the demand for euros increases. So I'm going to kind of talk through them in the same language so that we don't have to redraw the graph 5 times, but or 3 more times. But the increase in demand here from euros happens because the Americans have more income, and so now they're just going to buy more goods with that. In order to buy those goods, they have to demand more euros and they have to supply more dollars. The third one, price levels. If the prices are higher in a country, there's going to be more demand for the other country's goods and services. That's because if there are higher prices in one country, then the consumers in that country will want to buy things from the other country that are relatively cheaper now. In addition, the other country is going to buy less from the country that has higher prices as a result, right? So it's kind of a two-way street. For our purposes, we would say, for example, that maybe this would represent this picture that we've got graphed. Maybe this represents that US price levels, inflation has been really high. Well, and not the case in Europe. So the Americans would want to buy more European stuff because it's relatively cheaper. And that would increase the demand for euros and increase the supply of dollars. The fourth shifter here is interest rates, and this one affects the demand for financial assets, right? And so the way to kind of remember this is that if the interest rate changes, that's going to attract capital inflows. If it increases, more people around the world would say, I want to put my savings, my supply of loanable funds into your economy. I want to buy your financial assets, is another way to say that. And in order to actually move that money over into that economy to provide the loanable funds, they have to change their currency into the local currency. That, as a result, means there's a greater demand for their assets and a greater demand for their currency. So what that would look like here, maybe the case was that Europe has a higher real interest rate than the United States. Well, in order for the Americans to put their money into the European loanable funds market, they have to demand more euros. And so it would cause an increase in the demand for euros and an increase in the supply of dollars. So I kind of talked you through these four shifters here in the same direction so that you could kind of get an idea for these. But I will tell you that these get pretty challenging for students a lot of times. So it's important that we take some of the practice problems seriously with some of these. Hopefully this helped you understand the basics of Forex. I'll see you next time.